Hello my bookish friends out there in booktube land, and welcome to another episode of Tristan and the Classics. I've got a nice treat for you today. In this video we're going to be taking at 26 classic books that I've read in the first part of this year, and I will try my very best to endeavour to put them in the order in which I enjoyed them or felt that they had the most meaning or brilliance in literary terms. But of course, that's all subjective, so you can feel happy to disagree with me. Anyway, without further ado, let's dig in, shall we? In 26th place is The Black Tulip by Alexander Dumas. In this book, you have a character called Cornelius Bell who decides to start creating tulips. He gets invested in it, and he's got plenty of money, so he just enjoys it as a hobby. But his next door neighbour, a man called Boxtel, has for all his life devoted himself to tulips but doesn't have as much money. So when the Tulip Society of the Netherlands offer a prize for the first person who can reach the holy grail of making a black tulip, Boxtel becomes incredibly jealous of his next door neighbour Cornelius, who with his resources is able to plant and refine tulips until he finds a bulb which is hopefully the black tulip. This obsession and envy on the part of Boxtel will lead him to connive in Cornelius's downfall. The story will carry on and finds its remedy right at the end, wrapping up nicely. And it's a decent story, but why it's last on the list is because the first half of this book is fascinating. It's brilliant. The second half, it's like Dumas just sped through to make some money from his name, because at this point he was in fact broke. And so I feel he just sped to finish this book because he needed a bit of quick cash. So, The Black Tulip by Alexander Dumas. In 25th place is Lady Audley's Secret by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. This is a great romp of a read. There's nothing profound in it, it's just a good story. You have a man returning home by the name of George Talboys, and he's coming home from Australia where he's been for years to earn money for his wife and child. But just before he gets back, he finds his wife has died. He meets up with his friend, Robert Audley, who takes him back home to see his father. Now, his father has married a young ex-governess and taken her into the house by the name of Lucy. There she is, Lady Audley. When all the people meet, it goes okay to start with, but then George Talboys goes missing. Most people think he's just gone to Liverpool to catch a ship to America or Ireland, but his friend Robert smells a rat. Something's not quite right. What unravels is then the truth that Lady Audley has a dark secret. There is also blackmail involved. There is murder involved, a lot of intrigue. It's an excellent romp of a story, a mystery from the 19th century. In 24th place is The Age of Innocence by Edith Wharton. This focuses primarily on three characters. May Welland, Newland Archer. They are both from high society families and are affianced. Before the wedding day can arrive, a Countess Olenska comes into New York society from Europe, where she has disgracefully separated from her abusive husband. What follows is the tussle for Newland Archer over the correct girl to marry, or someone with imagination, someone with seductiveness and an exotic sense behind them. How will Countess Olenska react to Newland being interested in her? What you find in this book is a portrayal of the stultifying, oppressive parlours and salons of high-class New York in the 1870s to 1880s. And it questions the idea of whether we should do what is right or go with our heart. I don't think Edith Wharton executes this brilliantly, in my opinion. At times I found it too forced. However, the ending is absolutely beautiful. The ending is so exquisite that it's worth reading the whole book just to have that moment of breathlessness. In 23rd place is Farenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury. In this story, you have Guy Montag, who is a fireman. He doesn't put fires out, but this is in the future when there are teams of firemen who go out and burn books whenever they are discovered. The idea of the futuristic state is that books bring knowledge, knowledge gives you ideas, ideas lead to desires, and desires lead to discontent. Much better that the lowly populace be given their entertainment through television and nightclubs and the like. Guy Montag's in agreement with this until he meets a young girl who does, of all things, ask questions. And she keeps asking him questions. Why this? Why that? And it wakes up the latent curiosity in all human beings to the point where he begins to secrete away some of the books that he's meant to have burned. What will the state do when they find out? What will his co-workers think when they find out? Can he keep his newfound thoughts from coming out in his speech? This is what this book discusses. It's a very interesting read, although for me it was a little too thin. I thought Bradbury could have gone further to bulk out this book and give us more of what a state would be like that is completely crippled by a lack of free-flowing knowledge. In 22nd place is Hard Times by Charles Dickens. This is one of the few books by Dickens that is set outside of London. It's located in the make-believe city of Coketown, which symbolises the industrial towns that were growing in the north. And in this book, Dickens is taking shot at the utilitarian point of view of the masters of society, the growing use of science to dominate and organise the society of the day. In it, you have Mr. Gradgrind. He owns a school, but also owns his own mill. He has a supporting character called Mr. Bounderby, who is sort of the scourge of all humanity. He's horrible. And we see the dehumanizing effect of pure science. The workers are referred to in this as hands. Forget the rest of the personality. It's only their hands that count for manufacturing. When Sissy Jupe is introduced to Gradgrind to adopt her, things go a bit awry because Sissy Jupe was raised by a circus family, and so she is more into the joys of life and of feeling and emotion. She cannot comprehend the utilitarian way of analysing everything scientifically. When Gradgrind's son, Tom, also rebels against him, he begins to realise that there is more to life than just measuring everything out. People are not just tallies and scratches on the board. Add to this the heart-rending story of Stephen Blackpool, the wronged weaver, and you have a very good book. It's not Dickens' best, although some say it is. I really don't think it is. But as with all of his works, it's a social commentary that made a difference. In 21st place is Sybil by Benjamin Disraeli, the British Prime Minister. He wrote this before being a Prime Minister. It does give an insight into the mind of a reforming politician. The story centres on Sybil Gerard, who is the daughter of a man in the Chartist movement who wants to change the law in England, especially regarding political voting and the poor having a say and a vote in the way the country is run. She meets Charles Egremont, the scion of a aristocratic land-owning family, and this conflict of ideas, but how the eyes of Charles Egremont are opened to the horrible condition of the poor who are under his auspices. Disraeli portrays some of the most vivid, heartbreaking scenes of conditions the poor actually lived in the early 19th century. It's worth reading just for that. The book was also called The Two Nations because it was said by one of the characters in the book that the Queen Victoria reigns over two nations, the rich and the poor, so great is the difference in lifestyle between them. As the story goes, and I have a video about it up here if you want to check it out a bit further, as the story goes, it's not the best story, but the ideas, the political philosophies, which sounds deep but they're not, you will recognise today in this book, but so eloquently written. Has anything changed really in the way society is governed? Read Sybil and find out. In 20th place is Silas Marner by George Eliot. This is a very beautiful idyllic novel in many respects because it takes place in the make-believe village of Raveloe, which is not too far from the ever-spreading industrial towns of the day. Silas Marner, the main character, is a young lad who belongs to an evangelical church in the big cities, but when he is wrongly accused of something and his girlfriend goes off with his best friend, who is viewed by everyone else as the most pious person in the congregation, Silas loses his faith in God and humanity. He goes to work at Raveloe, the outskirts of a village where he doesn't wish to talk to anyone. He just works at his loom, constantly acquiring more and more money. It's sort of symbolic of the industrial age, that it just makes money. There is no spirituality about it. It hollows people out. When a little girl turns up in his hovel and the mother is found dead up the road, Silas takes it upon himself to raise her, and through sharing love with her and the assistance given by some of the women in the village, faith in humanity is restored, and a simpler, kinder spirituality is burgeoning in Silas's breast. However, all this time there is also the higher family in the village, the Casses. They have two sons, Durston, the youngest, who is a rake, and Geoffrey, the oldest, who should marry Nancy Lammeter, but for some reason weren't proposed to her, and no one seems to know why. Geoffrey and Silas are at the same time the same and the opposites of each other in the story. It's the same strife and problem they find, but in reverse order. A very, very enjoyable book by George Eliot. In 19th place is Perfume by Patrick Suskind, a modern classic, and one of the most brilliantly written books. The prose and the description in this book is phenomenal. There's not that much dialogue because Jean-Baptiste Grenouille, who is the protagonist in this, or the anti-hero you would say, he is a recluse. He sort of hates society, and society has always treated him badly. So really it's just describing what he sees. He's born in the beginning in Montmartre, where his mother just gives birth to him at a market stall and lets him lie in the offal hoping he'll die. He's then taken in by a nurse, and people are always uneasy around him. The nurse especially notices that he doesn't smell of anything. He has no smell. Ironically, as he grows up, it becomes evident that he has the greatest sense of smell in the world. And smell defines the way he understands things. His first word, wood, comes because he can smell wood. And it's more important, the smell, than the word. When he learns to capture the essence of things from a perfumier, he begins to develop that ability because he wants to capture every fragrance. But one escapes him, the smell of a young maiden. This is a book of desire and obsession and of death. It's quite grim. However, the description will make you want to go to your fridge and smell everything that's in it, because it's that moving, that amazing, the description of smells. The ending is Marmite. I don't know if you have Marmite in America. It's a yeast extract spread we have here in Britain, and you either love it or you hate it. The ending is just like that. I did not like the ending at all, and it was a bit towards the end I just had to skip over because, yeah. But, you know, it's for you to decide. However, the writing is just brilliant. So, a good book, Patrick Suskind's Perfume. In 18th place is The Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens, one of Dickens' few works of historical fiction. We have in here, a bit similar to Silas Marner actually, who spends 15 years in exile, as it were, after being wronged. We have Dr. Manette, who has been 18 years buried in the Bastille for a crime he didn't commit or doesn't know what he even did, and he's gone a bit loopy. But he's restored to life when he's released and handed over to his daughter, Lucy Manette, who takes him away to Britain to keep him out of the grasps of the aristocracy of France. While there, she meets Charles Darnay, a young gentleman with a past that no one seems to know about, but he's ever so pleasant, and he has an attraction to Lucy Manette and wants to help her with her father and will do anything for her out of love. We cross the channel back to France, where Dickens gives us a view of the revolution as it breaks out. And through two characters, Madame Defarge and her husband, Monsieur Defarge, who own a small wine shop, we see the plight of the poor, sympathy for their state and the need for change and revolution. Dickens recognises it, but through Madame Defarge, the nature of vindictiveness and wreaking vengeance on anyone that was from the high societies, and how a revolution can be as bloody and merciless as the regime that it replaces. Through all of this, Charles Darnay has a doppelganger called Sidney Carton, who looks just like him but has wasted his life. What we learn in this book is how the group can be wrong and how the individual can make the greatest difference. It starts with the famous opening, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times, but also contains one of the most famous closing lines in literature: "It is a far greater thing that I do now than I've ever done before." So that's a really recommended book by Charles Dickens. In 17th place is another Dickens, Oliver Twist. The famous story of the orphan boy who leaves the workhouse and tries to find his way in London, but gets absorbed into the underground of pickpockets and thieves, headed by Fagin and the violent and aggressive and abusive Sikes. This book is remarkable in that it saved tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of lives by bringing attention to the plight of not only the orphans in the workhouse and the dreadful conditions, and how Dickens satirises and mocks those who are in charge for being greedy, self-serving, pretentious characters, but also how young ones fall into a life of crime and of abuse and prostitution, and that the law just deals with them like criminals without any mercy. In the book, which contains a lot more than the films show you, Oliver has ups and downs, trying to find his way in a world, trying to keep the purity of conscience that a young child instinctively has, knowing what is good and bad. This book will put your heart in your throat. Some of the scenes are devastatingly sad. It was deliberately written in an emotional and somewhat sentimental way so that the public would feel for those who were suffering. So much so that Queen Victoria asked, "Do the poor and orphans really suffer like this?" And reform was the result. This is a great book. Dickens does the caricatures so well. But what it accomplished in the world, there are not many books that have ever come close to doing what Oliver Twist did. It's not the highest piece of literature, but it's a book you should definitely read. In 16th place is The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde, Oscar Wilde's only novel that he wrote. He wrote plenty of plays, but the only novel. This book is remarkable. Oscar Wilde, of course, being a wit, you expect and find plenty of great turns of phrase in here. Three main characters are involved. We have Dorian Gray himself, who is the very epitome of beauty. He is like a Greek statue in his looks and his youth. He has an artist, Basil Hallward, who loves him, and for Basil, Dorian is his muse, and he paints a fantastic painting of him. Then there is the charming and rakish Lord Henry Wotton, who espouses a philosophy of pleasure and aestheticism. He says to Dorian, "Is it not a shame that your picture will stay young while you yourself grow old with all the marks and lines that a life of sin and vice may bring upon you?" Dorian wishes it the other way, and so it happens that the painting grows old and has all the marks of evil and vice left upon it, whereas Dorian stays perpetually young. In this book, it's not just a story. You sense Oscar Wilde is questioning his own long-held views of aestheticism, that pleasure is what defines life. Art for art's sake, beauty is at the core of everything. Of course, later in his actual life, Oscar Wilde would face a crisis, he would go to prison, and he would change his views on the world. You sense in this book that he's already questioning the validity of the aesthetic philosophy, which seems to be embodied in none other than Henry Wotton himself, who is so persuasive but decadent. An absolutely brilliant book. In 15th place is Agnes Grey by Anne Bronte. Now, what can I say about this? Anne Bronte was a governess like her sisters, and in this book it's sort of semi-autobiographical because you can see it's her own experiences that she's seen in the house of the rich, whom she's been governess to their children. Why do children grow up to be so maladjusted or so vulgar or coquettish if they're girls, flirtatious or mean-spirited if they're boys? In this book, Anne Bronte, through Agnes Grey, shows us why. As Agnes Grey wants to help her family who are not rich, she goes to be a governess at a couple of families' houses, where the kids will not listen to her, and the parents, although they want Agnes to bring up their children to be these paragons of virtue and everybody praise them, they do not wish Agnes to discipline them or chastise them. If she asks the parents to do it, they just indulge the children further. She goes to 2 families and sees the effects of this on boys and girls, but in the meantime she does find morality and loving kindness and a sense of what is proper, right and uplifting amongst the poor, the lowly, the old, the infirm. It is influenced by the sort of evangelical Calvinist morality that was around in the day, but it's ever so well executed, and it involves a bit of a love story too. In 14th place is the phenomenally witty Epitaph of a Small Winner by Machado de Assis, the Brazilian classic author. This book, though written about 40 years ago, reads like one of the most modern novels you'll ever get. The narrator, Brás Cubas, is dead. As in, he didn't write and has died, but he is deceased and is now writing. Looking back from the afterlife on his time on Earth, living, and weighing up what he made of life, whether he was a success in life or not. The way he goes through it is not with a clearly delineated plot. The chapters are tiny, half a page long for most of them. And in those chapters, he just gets snapshots of memories and nostalgia, which he pieces together slowly into a form of looking at what was important in his life. He looks at the institution of marriage, love, goals and ambitions which we think are cast iron, but then we change our minds. First loves, giving our heart to someone and thinking we are in love when it was purely infatuation. Being betrayed, adultery, mixing with high society, fame, the state of religion and its attitude towards the poor and the wealthy. Ultimately, Brás Cubas comes out with the idea that he was a winner in life, but only just. Hence, Epitaph of a Small Winner. But why he considers himself a winner would surprise you. You'll have to read it to find out. But an excellent, excellent, riveting read. In 13th place is the powerful Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. Charlotte Bronte said that her sister Emily had a force of character and writing that she didn't understand herself. And this book just brims and broods like the mammoths beneath a thundercloud that just loom upon the earth. The book itself, Cathy and Heathcliff, the famous couple, it's not just about obsession, but it's about bearing a grudge, resentment, but the power of the passions fused between 2 people and giving oneself over completely to one's passions and desires. Heathcliff does not belong to the family. He is an orphan who is found by the father who brings him home from Liverpool, but he indulges this orphan boy more than his own children, causing resentment between them. So when the father dies, the son takes over, who really hates Heathcliff. In the meantime, though, Heathcliff and Cathy, the daughter, have formed this unreal, unworldly bond, attachment soul to soul that would cross time and space. But things do not work out the way Heathcliff wants, and it grips him and turns him, already an angry person, into the most malevolent, vindictive character you might meet in a lot of literature. He dwells at the Gothic Wuthering Heights, which is a deliberate double against the more calm Grange, Thrushcross Grange, where another family lives and where there is a deadly enmity. The abuse in this book, the mental abuse, the physical abuse, is terrifying. It burdens you. But what brings about Heathcliff's change? And how significant is that change? Well, you'll have to read it to find out. But be prepared to be surprised. If you haven't read it, it's not what you think. In 11th place, and I understand, because I'm doing this quickfire, I may have got the numbers back to front, but the number will flash here somewhere. In 11th place is To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. Absolutely adored this book. It's so perfectly written. In it is the famous Atticus Finch, a lawyer who has been employed by the town to defend a black man who has been accused of raping a white girl. The prejudices and the small-mindedness of the town come into clear relief here, because the girl who accuses him of raping her is trailer trash. No one likes her family, no one trusts them, but because it's a black man that's been accused, they instantly believe and want to defend the white girl because it's a protection for them as well, they feel. But the narrative is actually taken from the perspective of Atticus's young daughter, Scout. They have a neighbour who they never see, and like children do, they invent these scary, spooky tales about what the person hidden behind closed doors is like. There's mysterious notes and objects left in the tree in the next door garden. There's an array of different characters in the neighbourhood which the children learn bits from, but you see their prejudices too. There's a little bit of symbolism within here, but ultimately Atticus teaches and navigates his children, despite opposition from the whole town, in how to be meek, kind to others, and never to prejudge or be prejudiced against anyone, regardless of their race or economic background. This is just such a brilliant book, and it leaves on a bit of a cliffhanger, but you feel and wish that you had Atticus Finch as part of your family. In 11th place, at least I think that's where I am. I'm doing this all in one slew of a recording in quickfire, so the numbers are getting jumbled up in my head. But in 11th place is the brilliant, absolutely fantastic Mayor of Casterbridge by Thomas Hardy. Thomas Hardy is one of my favourite authors. If you were to sum up Thomas Hardy's works in one word, it would be suffering. And if you added one other word, fate or chance. In the book Thomas Hardy, it's a discussion of nature or nurture in some respects. The subheading is a man of character. So the Mayor of Casterbridge, a man of character. And you have Michael Henchard, who at the very beginning sells his wife and child because he's drunk. After many years pass, the wife and the grown-up child come back to England, where they go to Casterbridge, where they've heard there is a Henchard there who is a merchant, and they think it might be family and he might be able to help them. It actually turns out to be the actual Michael Henchard, the father and husband. And he's the mayor. He has completely transformed his life and his way of living and his attitude around. He has forsworn alcohol because of what it caused him to do when he was younger. But life changes. How will he respond when his wife and daughter turn up? Can he continue to do the right thing? What about a girl who he has actually begun to give his heart to before his wife returns? And when he brings in a young Scotchman called Farenheit, who is so personable and the workers love him, and who feels free to stand up to Michael when he makes wrong decisions, will his old character dominate? Or can someone master their character enough to control their stars? You must read this book. And we have arrived at the top 10. Are you ready? In 10th place of the 26 books I read in the first part of the year, Jane Austen's Persuasion. Here we have Anne Elliot and Frederick Wentworth, the captain. They were once in love in their younger days, but Frederick went to sea after Anne was dissuaded from marrying him. And this is where persuasion comes in. It's not literally persuading someone of your way of thinking, but your persuasion, the way you live, the way you see the world. Anne belongs to the family that lives at Kellynch Hall. Her father dotes on his family's lineage and patronage, and peerage is the one. He's very much into Debray's Guide of Etiquette kind of person. Society and prestige and position are everything to him and his daughter. They go to Bath, they do the Bon Ton circuit of Britain, and you see them in Bath, lazing away their days, being bored, but trying to put on the pretences that are expected of those who are fashionable. Anne, on the other hand, takes care of the family. She's a thoughtful person. She prefers nature and enjoying the company of simpler folk. One of the families that she loves, they're a bit rambunctious and boisterous, but she loves them dearly. Then Frederick Wentworth returns, and we have a whole different host of people and how they cross paths and we see their persuasions of living, whether it be money, whether it be prestige, whether it be prominence, whether it be pure happiness, whether it be propriety, or whether it be love. What influences all of us in our behaviour? This is a very serious and thoughtful work for Jane Austen, and between this and Mansfield Park, it's probably the most critical of our inner attitudes, not just satirising the traits and foibles of the day. In ninth place is the novella The Old Man and the Sea by Ernest Hemingway. Ernest Hemingway's writing is Spartan, terse. He gets to the point. He doesn't do much in terms of frippery and chintz and lace and all that kind of stuff, the edges. He likes to get on with the point. In this book, he sort of steps a little bit away from that style and embellishes a bit more, but not much. Don't get carried away. The story itself centres on the old man who wants to go to sea to catch a good catch of fish. The reason, he's on a terrible streak. He's been out, I think it's nearly 80 days without catching fish. So much so that the people in the harbour and village don't want to have anything to do with him because he is cursed when it comes to fishing, and that's their livelihood. Even the little boy who loves him is told by his parents, you mustn't help him anymore. So he sets out to sea and snags a large fish, a marlin, on his line, deep, deep down below. The description that Hemingway puts in of one man in a rowing boat being pulled through the sea by a strong marlin, the way he describes the cuts on his hand as he lets the line out, how it sort of hooks across his back because he needs to lean against the wire because the fish is so powerful, how the boat lifts and speeds, the different creatures like turtles and Portuguese man-o'-war, the dolphin flesh that he eats and how it tastes sweet, the sun from the Sargasso Sea, the salt in the wounds and in the lips. This book is about life. Some say it's boring, and that's understandable because very little actually happens. But you see life from a perspective of a man who has lived it all, who has his little beliefs, his little idols, who remembers what it was to be young. Now, if you want a proper review of this book after you've read it, because it will take you not long at all, it's only 100 pages, please go and look at my in-depth review of this book because it is a work of genius. So that was number 9. Now, in number 8 could easily have been Hemingway because this one, I think they're interchangeable. It's another novella, and that is A Month in the Country by J.L. Carr. This book is just perfection. It is a little pearl, a golden nugget of literature. It's perfectly symmetrical, this. It's a great book just to analyse literature through. You have the two characters, Birkin and Moon. They're both men who have been in the First World War. They've come home, and Birkin is the narrator. He is going to restore a painting in a church, an out-of-the-way church in a small, quaint hamlet called Oxgoodby. He's not a painter, but he just has to pull back the plaster and whitewash to reveal an old medieval fresco. You just follow his time on the scaffolding as he peels it back and looks at the characters and gets to feel a connection with the person who painted this scene hundreds of years before him. And there's sort of a link across time. And why is he so good, this painter, for half of the fresco, but then for the last part, he doesn't give as much attention? Birkin wonders this. At the same time, just outside the church, just on the edges, the other side of the wall, is a character called Moon, who is a very affable fellow. He's an archaeologist and he's been employed to discover an old ancestor of someone in the village. While he's there, he thinks he'll make the best of it and stay as long as he can being paid because he thinks he knows where the ancestor already is buried, but he's discovered some remnants of a Roman settlement and he wants to explore that. The person who he follows or is trying to find has a reminiscence to Moon himself, just as the artist in the church has a reminiscence to Birkin. And then there is a love interest. And what you get from this book, what is so sublime about this book, is it literally captures the essence of that small moment in time when you were there, when life was life, that indefinable, something that we all feel deep inside, and it swells us up. It makes us alive, but we can't put our finger on it. And how you briefly recognize your link in the chain of all humanity through time, that everyone has lived a moment just like I am right now. It is brilliant. So there it is, A Month in the Country by J.L. Carr. In 7th place is a book that I recently did a big review on, and that is Cannery Row by John Steinbeck, another masterpiece. Now, if you say Hardy is suffering in one word, Steinbeck is meaning in life. Because reading biographies of him, even though I've not read many of his books, what I have seen and come to know is that he is nearly always exploring a philosophical or spiritual angle. He's just putting it to the test through story. And I'm not going to tell you what it is in this story. You'll have to watch the video. But the book itself is great. It focuses on Doc and a group of down and outs in Cannery Row, Monterey, not too far from San Francisco. Doc is a marine biologist. He's always kind to everybody in his area. But in the area, you have reprobates. You have the down and outs, the bums, the do-no-goods, the prostitutes, the thieves, the liars, the drunks. And yet, in it, despite those characters, you want to belong to their community. Because there's a group of boys with Mac as their leader. And they don't go to work. They just live each day as it comes. They don't follow the American dream. But they are happy. And Doc begins to think that they are the philosophers, the wise men, the sages of our time. Not the people who know how to make it in big business, who have grand mansions to live in, but these guys who live in an old rundown storehouse for keeping fish in. They've got it. And honestly, it's just brilliant. The actual plot is very thin and loose. They want to throw a party for Doc because the community want to throw a party for Doc because he's such a nice guy. The party goes wrong, so they try to make amends by throwing another party. Around that is an absolute host of vignettes of characters and their lives which seem disconnected, but which explore one critical central thought. But you'll have to read it and watch the review to find out what that is. In 6th place on this list is Lord Jim by Joseph Conrad. Conrad, he too can be summed up in his works with one word, and that is solitude. The solitude that every individual can feel, even if they're surrounded by others. Lord Jim follows or tracks the course of a young lad through the narration of Marlowe, who is also the narrator to Heart of Darkness as well. But this lad, Jim, he trains to be a sailor and he thinks he's going to do great things. He thinks of himself in heroic terms, saving people. At the beginning, when a lad falls into the sea, it's Jim that jumps over to save him. And he thinks that's what he wants to be. That's how he's going to be. He is different from other men. He is great. But then an event happens on a steamship carrying 800 Muslims to Mecca on their pilgrimage. It strikes an unknown object in the Arabian Gulf. And while everyone is still sleeping, the crew realise that they're going to sink, but there's not enough lifeboats. So they plan to abandon ship without waking anyone so as not to cause a rush where all the boats would be ruined. Jim knows this is not ethically correct. The boat is just holding steady, but a squall is coming in and it will sink the ship. When he sees the crew go over, he has to make a decision whether to stay nobly, as he perceives himself in mind, but he makes the snap decision to jump as well. The rest of the book follows him dealing with his conscience for doing that, the fallout, the inability to forgive oneself, the ability to judge others for what they have done, and the famous and provoking line by Marlowe, who keeps saying he was one of us. He is one of us. He ends up setting himself up to take care of a group of natives in one of the Pacific archipelagos, where another massive choice comes his way. And does he get the choice right? And what's the consequences? Solitude. Even though surrounded, he is solitary because he has lost connection with his own self-identity. How can a person live like that? Conrad is a somewhat more difficult read, an intermediate to hard read in the classics because he's very literary in his style. But if you can crack into Comrade, he is a really, really deep character that makes you think. So we're down to the top 5 out of our list of 26 books, and all of these are gold dust. Absolutely brilliant works of literature. In 5th place is the highly influential, for literary reasons, The Red and the Black, or The Scarlet and the Black by Stendhal. This book, one of the founding books of realism, it had a profound effect on later writers. The story of The Scarlet and Black is of a young lad, he's the son of a carpenter, I think he is, who is called Julian Sorel. And he lives at the time 1829, because this is captured all in one year. Sorel is quite gifted, he has a great memory for things, but he is quite independent and he desires very much to rise to the top. He wants to be a somebody. His problem is that Napoleon's reign is over, he's gone. Under Napoleon, if a man entered the military, he could, through merit, climb the ranks, just as Napoleon did, from a gunner all the way to emperor. But now that Napoleon's gone, the aristocrats are back. It's all back down to who you knew and what your family was. And so the army offers no career to the top. What he does find, though, is there is a route through the church to become prominent. And so he begins to make his progress. But what he learns is that to make your way in a world where there are liberals who really want to grow in order to become wealthy, and aristocrats who want to re-establish their prestige and position as the arbiters of good society, all that you need to be is hypocritical. He's told early on that he'll get nowhere if he speaks his mind. He has to say exactly opposite to what he truly believes. He begins to despise people for this hypocrisy and this absolute mediocrity, a world in which the mediocre are the ones that get the positions and those with any abilities are kept down deliberately because people are envious of them. He gets involved with a family called the Renals, who have an aristocratic background, where he becomes enamoured of Madame de Renal and seduces her and feels a joy that he is dominating an aristocrat, that he's robbing an aristocrat of his wife. Then he moves as a secretary into the Marquis de la Pole's employment, who has a daughter, Mathilde, who is the belle of society, whom all the young dukes and counts want to marry. But she notices and becomes fascinated with Julian because she is sick of the pretense of society, and Julian, although learning hypocrisy, is so dour and determined and his own man. She finds him attractive. And what happens next is we try to see Julian satisfy his own desires and continue to climb the ladder of success. The way the book rounds out, though, wow! The whole book is this disparate load of threads, and to a degree a lot of boredom, because that is the society that they are in. But in the last couple of chapters, the whole thing just reaches a crescendo, and you can see the criticism that Stendhal is throwing at society, saying you are all mediocre. We need to bring in a society where those who are great can ascend to greatness. It is a real strong critique. It's just brilliant, but like I say, a forerunner or a founder of the realist movement in literature. It changed literature, this book. In 4th place is the wonderful and astounding, heart-wrenching, tear-jerking Tess of the D'Urbervilles by Thomas Hardy. Again, Thomas Hardy, such a good writer, so atmospheric, brilliant in description of the Wessex scenery. But the way he wraps his ideas together, the way he searches for meaning in a world full of arbitrary occurrences, of fate, of mischance, of sadness, of injustice. Tess herself, the daughter of a poor drunk, she tries to help the family's fortune by going to work for someone who carries the aristocratic name d'Urberville, which the priest has said to the father that your lineage goes back to the famous d'Urbervilles, these aristocrats. And so Tess is told to go and meet this man and work for him so that maybe he will help them out because he's family. that is not how it works out, and she's basically thrown into the lion's den. She makes her way out to another part of the county where she meets a man called Angel Clare. No accident that he's called Angel. It's a very ironic twist by Hardy, because he's exploring two ends of the philosophical spectrum simultaneously. The way she first hears him playing the cello as she walks through the garden outside of this dairy farm where she's gone to work is just magnificent, because it's so beautiful, and yet Hardy uses all the ugly things. He uses toads and snails and mallows and bogweed and slime and cobwebs. That's what she's walking through, but it sounds just perfect. It's nature. And Tess seems to be the epitome of someone who works in harmony with nature. The love story is fantastic. The twists and turns will break your heart, and the ending, wow, the ending hits home and is devastating in the sense that Hardy himself hasn't quite solved his own conundrum that he brings up in this book, but he leaves you to do it. And that's what's so fascinating. This, please, 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 if you haven't read Tess of the D'Urbervilles, read it. You won't regret it. In third place in this list is Bleak House by Charles Dickens. An absolute masterpiece of literature and carving out of a story. The story itself focuses on a case in Chancery Court. Chancery Court was a problem in the day. You'll have to look at my video, 100 Books You Should Read, Bleak House. Jarndyce and Jarndyce is the case, and we have two suitors, Ada and Richard, who have been brought in after years of wrangling. They are now the best suitors to the claim. They're looked after by Emma Summerson, who goes around with them as a companion, and a John Jarndyce, who will have nothing to do with the case because it ruins everyone whom it touches. Here you have Dickens at his finest, lambasting one of the institutes of the day, the courts, and their injustice, that they serve the lawyers and not the people. Alongside it, you have various caricatures, as is Dickens' wont, one of them being Crook, who owns a pawn shop right near Chancery Court, and he seems to be a mirror image in a defiled and disgraced way of the Chancery Court. At the same time, another plot is running with a Lady and Sir Dedlock. She is the height of fashion, where she is all of the fashionable elite want to be, but she is bored stiff. Her husband loves her, but he's older than her, and he is dull, and he is very stuck in his ways and loves the aristocracy. Then it becomes revealed that she has a dark secret, but what is it? And how does it lead her down the lanes to Crook's, this miserly pawn shop owner? How does she link with the case Jarndyce and Jarndyce and the characters who are currently involved in the narration? Behind all of this is the gaunt, ever-present phantom of Tulkinghorn, the long, lean and aged lawyer who knows all the secrets of the aristocracy, a repository of all of their personal details, vices and backgrounds. There is something malevolent and envious and reaching and grasping about Tulkinghorn, although he barely speaks. What will happen to him? What does he find out about Lady Dedlock? And who is the central figure in this book? The central figure in this book is not a main character. And yet the whole world orbits on it. It's such a clever dual narration, and the way it pivots on this one character, although the story's not about him, it totally is. And is there a deep worry behind this story, beyond just social reform, that Dickens is worried about? In fact, I sense there's something in The Red and the Black by Stendhal that Dickens is constantly referring to. But you'd have to read it to find out, and perhaps I will do an in-depth review of this sooner rather than later. The top two books in this list could be interchangeable depending on my mood, but the way I've got them at the moment places in second place Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy. I've talked about this in another video, and someone said about Tolstoy's writing, and in particular Anna Karenina, that it is not a novel, it is a slice of life. It's just this portion of life pulled out. The Russian tradition of literature is different from the Western, European tradition. It's far more vast in its scope. It captures life in all its different shades. There are so many conversations in Anna Karenina that are insignificant to the plot. It's just people being people, talking. But the plot is still very distinct. It's just the way he populates the world around. What it does, it doesn't just give you a backdrop. You land in Moscow. You land in the rural villages of Russia, where you can stand and absorb the environment, not just of the landscape, but of being there, being a person. You observe and are enabled to pass judgment or consideration on what's being talked about. The story itself follows Anna Karenina, who is married to an insipid husband who is a government official, and that's all he focuses on, working for the government and rising through the ranks. He's an attentive husband, but not exactly loving, and they have a young son. Now, Anna Karenina tries to keep happy in her marriage. She pays attention to her youngster, and she keeps out of the way of high society, even though she used to be sort of at the centre of it. And then one day she meets Count Vronsky, a younger officer of the cavalry, and he's immediately bewitched by her. It happens at a train station, which is quite significant, as it symbolises the spread of modernity and the dragging of people from the country way of living into the big cities, and the cauldron and effect that that city has upon people's morality and way of living. Eventually, Karenina and Vronsky get into an affair. This is no spoiler because, well, that's what the book's known for anyway. And Tolstoy sort of examines the role of structures in society, the role of the government and the church when it comes for divorce, the rightness of living a happy life with someone you love, as opposed to the strictures of marriage with someone that is not love, where there's no love within your relationship, just maybe respect. And he explores this. Now, it's interesting because Tolstoy's sister was in the same position. She was married to someone and she tried to break from him, couldn't get a divorce, and went, I think it was either Germany or Sweden she went to live in with some other man. So Tolstoy was familiar with the setup and the fact that the church wouldn't allow a divorce, the institution itself. So he explores this. He explores the effect of society on the characters themselves, how Vronsky is influenced by his friends, how Anna Karenina's entering back into higher society has a corrupting effect, sort of undermining her resolve not to give herself to somebody else when she's already married. All of this is counterbalanced with the story of Levin. Levin is a great character. He's got his weaknesses, his foibles, his insecurities, but he's a good man. But he does make mistakes and he gets a bit grumpy. But what he's focused on is life in the country. He wants to develop his lands, his farms, his woods, and focus on life outside the city. The city gets on his nerves. He doesn't like it. He himself wants to get married. He wants to have a family. And some of the best writing in this is not actually the story. It's just the picturesque scenes of the countryside where where Levin is joining the peasants who have been recently emancipated in cutting swathes of wheat, all working in a line together. And the way that's described and the toil and the good it does to him. And although he's not one of them, when he lays back and listens to their light conversation, although he's not quite part of it because he's higher than them, he wants to be with them, but all of that lands you in the time period, but not in a atmospheric sense just for the effect on the novel, but actually as if you were living there. And it gets you just to look at life. We live in the hurly-burly of modernity now. You know, the majority of people on earth live in cities, not in the countryside. And that's had a definite effect. Where does happiness lie, though? Also, when it comes to marriage opposed from the countryside to marriage inside the city, does that put undue restraints or blessings just depending on the environment of where your marriage is? All of this is captured in this book, a slice of life, and the way the book culminates, absolutely brilliant. And so we get to the first book on our list of 26 books I read in the first part of this year. This book is by a brilliant author. It had a powerful effect on me. Funnily enough, it was the first book I read this year as well. And it stuck with me that long. It's so good in its scope of invention from within the mind, the inner monologue, the tumult that we feel as human beings with our conscience. It takes an idea and explores it. It takes a philosophy, plants it in a character, albeit fictional. The character gives the philosophy feelings, emotions, mental thoughts, forces the philosophy to come out of an ivory tower to interact with the world around it, and takes it to its logical conclusion. That book is Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky, an unbelievably good book. If you're just starting out in the classics, generally I'll probably say don't start with this one, because it's a rather prolonged sort of narration style. Raskolnikov is dealing with inner thoughts all the time. He notices minutiae of the streets and the taverns and drunks and their mannerisms, the idle conversation that is trapped in this book, which doesn't seem to add to the plot but adds to the ensemble of living life at a particular time under a particular worldview. And that worldview is nihilism. Nihilism was burgeoning in Russia, coming from the universities through the students who thought that everything needed to be brought to naught in order to start again. Nihilism does not mean ruining everything. It is not anarchist. Turgenev was the writer who coined the term nihilism. And what it meant was, to improve society, you can't keep tweaking the institutions. It is a failed setup. Everything needs to be brought down, and in that sense it sounds like anarchy, but to then be rebuilt for the benefit of everybody. But Dostoevsky explores the attitude of nihilism and takes it to a logical conclusion. The main focus is through Raskolnikov. He is this student, very morose. He's starving to death because he hasn't gone to work. He's like, the problem, he actually put, it's typical actually that he's this student who's all cerebral and is ignoring the practicalities of life. I think there's a message in that. But he has this idea of the Superman that is a forerunner to the Übermensch in German philosophy. They can break moral laws because it's beneficial for society as a whole. And some people have just got it. He's constantly referring to Napoleon, who of course led many a person to death on the battlefield, but he's considered great for what he did. So Raskolnikov comes up with this idea that there's a miserly old lady, a hag, a louse and a cockroach, he calls her, because she gives nothing to society, but she has lots of money. People pawn their goods to her and she lends out to them. In fact, Raskolnikov himself has to pawn his goods to her just to find stuff to eat with. And he thinks, if I killed her, I could take the money and use it so much better for starting up a movement for the benefit of society. Eventually he will act on this idea, but the fallout is conscience. How do you deal with what you've done? Can anyone truly reach beyond morality and be innocent and it have no effect whatsoever? Raskolnikov struggles with guilt, the fear of being caught, that people can read him, because the actual escape when he's committed the crime is fabulous to read. It's a real thriller section. And yet he kicks against his conscience because he thinks, theoretically, my idea is absolutely sound. This woman was a waste of space and I could use that money for the benefit of others, helping the poor, for instance. But nonetheless, he is tormented and he carries this burden around with him. Significantly, there are three characters around him. There is Razumihim, his best friend, Sophia, a girl who is religious but fell to prostitution, but remains very, very religious despite her lifestyle. And then the menacing Svidrigailov. Now, I have an in-depth review of Crime and Punishment, and if you've read the book, I think you might like it. It's about 45 minutes, but we go deep, and these three names matter because they all mean something and depict something. But Dostoevsky himself, through writing this, had a change of attitude in his own outlook on life. I won't tell you what it is. The original ending to this book is phenomenally sweet. And when I say sweet, I don't mean, oh, it's lovely. but it's just such a sweet touch the way it finishes. He then adds an epilogue later, which arguably some don't think adds to the story. They think it lessens the weight of the story. Others love it because they feel that Dostoevsky has rounded out the whole picture and left an imprint of the message. For me, I side with the first group, which is I don't think he should have written the epilogue, but it didn't surprise me, the epilogue, because I could conclude from the story that that is exactly how Dostoevsky would feel. However, that's up for you to judge. But that was a phenomenal book. Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky, the best book of the year I've read so far. So that's the list of 26 books I have read in the first part of this year. Which ones have you read? How many of them have you read? Are there any favourites there of yours? Are there any that you think, oh, that sounds appealing, I'm going to go away and read that? And also, do me a favour, write in the comments below. Even if you've never commented on a YouTube channel before, just do this for me. Write down what's your favourite book that you have read this year. And especially if it's a classic, I will really pay attention to it because I always want to know what classics people are enjoying, whether it's because I get them as a recommendation or because I know that that's what people would like to discuss further. Anyway, until the next video, I wish you joy in your reading.